we spoke about anger and forgiveness and dealing with that. And I did mention that the Stoics, of course, have spoken about dealing with emotions. So today it's time for another lesson on the Stoics. And today we're going to look at the Stoic issue of dealing with emotion and dealing with reaction, which certainly leads on from what we've said about anger, and in fact the whole idea that stoicism is related to keeping a stiff upper lip and so on can be understood when we understand the way that stoicism talks about controlling emotion. One of the most important Stoic writers, perhaps the most important, was Epictetus. He lived in the 1st century and he was in fact a freed slave, one of the most important teachers of Marcus Aurelius. So it is fascinating to think that the emperor, who's remembered for being one of the great philosophical minds of the ancient world, was in fact schooled by a slave, who undoubtedly was one of the great philosophical minds of the ancient world, and reminds us that philosophy is the great equalizer, and that both slaves and emperors are concerned with exactly the same things as each other and as we are. The whole issue about controlling emotional reactions that distress ourselves and distress others is about controlling the reaction. It's not about not having emotions, being Dr. Spock and never having any emotions. And that's what's misunderstood about Stoicism. The apparent stiff upper lip of Stoicism is not about being unemotional or cold. It's not allowing the reaction to cause further problems, because there's a lot about the reaction that is the problem, and that was what Epictetus wanted us to know. Remember that, as I've said before, philosophy is not about highfalutin ideas in the mind. It's meant as a practical guide for living, and those ancients were concerned in finding solutions to the difficulties of living every day in this difficult world. It's hard to find happiness, and philosophers were concerned with the finding of happiness. We had an episode on happiness when we introduced the ideas of the Stoics, and in that episode on happiness, we said that there's a basic Stoic principle that says, master your anger so that it doesn't master you. There are so many things that anger us. Think about social media these days. It's really brought out what seems to be the worst in people. Certainly, we can't always avoid feeling the anger, but we can avoid the unnecessary, excessive emotional responses that often inflame ourselves and inflame others into a much worse situation. Social media being such a great example of that. So, at the very least, we can seek a more moderate reaction. And in that episode, I said that the basic ideas of Stoicism are firstly to avoid responding until the emotion has calmed down. To also remember that you are not perfect either. And also to try and see things from other people's points of view. It's important to manage your expectations as well. Be realistic about life. Life doesn't always go as planned. So those were the very first ideas we explored when understanding how Stoicism is related to the quest for happiness. We also, in the first episode on Stoicism itself, explored the very first, most basic Stoic exercise, and that is to examine your own impressions. The Stoics use that word impressions a lot, which really means how things affect you and how you react to them. So we're talking about reactions. But the impression that things make on you, that's what the Stoics were really concerned with. Because, as they've said, we are in control of that. We're not in control of those things themselves. So the important thing is to separate the thing that causes the reaction from the reaction itself, so that you can be more rational about it. then ask yourself, is this under my control? If it is, do something about it, and if it's not, accept it calmly, because there's nothing you can do about it. The important thing about why we must do that is that when there is nothing we can do about it, that emotion is going to affect us adversely. So Epictetus says that impressions, reactions, are the storms which drive out reason. Why Stoicism is often compared with Dr. Spock of Star Trek fame is because it wasn't simply about not reacting emotionally, but it was also about using the rational mind in order to manage and control your reactions. Because remember, all you really are in control of is your reactions. So Epictetus, in his very practical way, has a chapter in his remarkable writings called the Discourses, which deals with controlling your impressions. It's a remarkable text that's very well worth the read, and the Oxford World Classics translation is something that is very accessible. So for those of you interested in looking further into him, his life and his writings, check that out. So he has a section specifically on exactly what we're talking about, how to control your reactions and impressions. And very uncharacteristically for an ancient text, it's actually written like a how-to, where it's step by step. The fascinating thing, of course, about these ancient how-tos is that when you read them, they could have been written in contemporary times. It's striking to see that the advice Epictetus gives us about dealing with emotions and dealing with habits 2,000 years ago is something that we would hear today as contemporary, even sometimes great cutting-edge modern advice on how to deal with them. Indeed, as Shakespeare told us, there is nothing new under the sun, and as we see from the writings of Shakespeare, Epictetus, the Greeks and everyone else, that a lot of what occupied our minds has always been occupying our minds. And a lot of what causes trouble in our lives is the same old stuff that always has. And Epictetus and the Stoics would say the main thing that causes trouble is how you react, how you respond to things. And we perhaps know that even better than Epictetus because we've seen that with social media, with the concept of the Twitter storm. When something goes mad and the next thing there's a huge drama that people are caught up in, that goes on for ages, that might be distinct from the original thing which caused that dramatic reaction. We are surrounded by excellent examples of the problem that Epictetus is referring to. So Epictetus, in his step-by-step, tells us firstly to remember that both habits and skills are created by practice. If you do something over and over again, you get good at it. If you don't do something for a long time, like a month, you lose it. So in general, says Epictetus, if you want to get good at something, do it often. And if you don't want to do something in your life, stop doing it, and it will gradually find a way. Even more so, says Epictetus, find some other thing to develop a habit about, and that will refocus your energy. Well, he doesn't say refocus your energy, but that advice is something that we hear frequently, to replace old bad habits with new good habits. And it comes all the way back from Epictetus. He's using all of that to introduce the point that this applies to states of mind as well. We can talk about learning a language as a habit, or stopping an addiction like smoking, or any other habits which get in the way. But he says, think about states of mind. When you lose your temper, he says, you should recognize that not only has something happened to you at present, but also that you've reinforced a bad habit, and that you have, so to speak, added fresh fuel to the fire. That's from his second discourse. Well, you wouldn't believe that that came from 2,000 years ago, but it's very important that he says it's not only the current situation, you are teaching yourself anger. You're creating anger as a habitual way to respond. think about what Epictetus is saying, the extent to which our reactions are actually habits. We're so used to reacting in a particular way, we've so constructed a reality, a kind of a script that says, how dare they? Last week on the anger show, I spoke about how essentially anger and reaction to is often a status issue. Someone makes you angry because you feel that they've diminished their status. We say mean things to other people in order to increase our own status. So there's a whole status issue going on there. And so we've got a script that says, when someone offends my status, I respond this way. And I automatically get outraged, and I'll say the following things, and the whole thing escalates. Think about it. To what extent are your reactions actually habit? Epictetus says, when a reaction is wrong, if we fail to interrogate ourselves and apply a remedy, the next time we react much more readily that way. It becomes easier. And if we keep on doing that, a callus develops. Like a callus on your skin. A callus develops, and the behavior becomes entrenched. Epictetus warns us that we don't become inured and immune in some way because we've got automatic reactions. No, rather, we must have thoughtful, thought-through, rational reactions to things. We mustn't cut off completely, and we mustn't get into the script. Epictetus goes on to tell us, scars and bruises are left behind on the mind, and I quote, and if one doesn't erase them completely, it will be no longer bruises that are found there when one receives further blows on that spot, but wounds. So important that he says, if you don't deal with your hurtful reaction, the next time you get hurt the same way, you now become wounded, and it's much harder to heal. Don't leave it untreated. Don't leave emotional scars untreated. They become emotional wounds. Remarkable advice from all those years ago. So Epictetus's guide to controlling bad temper goes as follows. Firstly, keep calm and don't react. Pause. Breathe before you react. Resist the impulsive and the instinctive reactions and think. Think about it. What you really want to do is keep a journal, says Epictetus. And in fact, the Stoics kept journals for everything, how to manage yourself. And we've spoken about that extensively last year in my spiritual guide, in keeping a journal and reflecting every day on your progress. And that comes from the Stoics originally. And the idea is you try and score for the journal. Try and get yourself so that this afternoon or this evening, when I'm revising my day, I'm able to say, I used to lose my temper every day, but now I didn't lose it today. That's from Epictetus. Make a note. So you want to be able to write in your journal, I did not lose my temper today. And if you're conscious of that, and if you actually use the journal as the motivation, then you're going to be much more aware of your reactions and thinking it through at the time. I'm trying to be able to get that into my journal. I won't let myself react. This is a reason to think it through. Because if we try and use other reasons, like don't be angry, don't make it worse, it doesn't deal with our sense of outrage or being justified in what we're doing. But if we do something for ourselves, when we say, I get to write in my journal, I didn't get angry today, then we have got a motivation. Epictetus says, count how many days since you were angry. And he quotes, you might be writing, I used to lose my temper every day, then every other day, then every third, and then every fourth. And he says, and if you continue in that way, until you write one day, I used to lose my temper every day, and now I have not lost my temper for 30 days. He says, mark that date, celebrate that date, give thanks for that date, because you've made a major breakthrough. Going on, Epictetus says, after 2 or 3 months like that, and keeping on your guard for anything that might excite or distress you, then you are doing nicely. He's realistic and he's honest. He says you need to manage yourself because he's referred us to habits in the first place. And how, of course, we all know that even once we've mastered them, it's possible to lose them easily. He reminded us of that. It's not about the old habit coming back. Your instinctive reaction to anger might easily come back because your method, your new habit of not responding has fallen away. What happens when you don't play your instrument for a long time? What happens when you don't speak that language for a long time? You lose the habit. And that's why Epictetus says you must monitor yourself, because if you assume that, of course, you've conquered it, it's going to come right back after another 30 days or so when the new habit falls away. So a very powerful early psychologist. One thing that the ancient world differs from us in one way, and that is that they didn't have apps. So yes, we have journals, and yes, you should be writing in that journal, but it is fascinating that there is a crop of apps for your phone or your tablet that help you break habits or create new good habits. And the way they work is exactly the way that Epictetus described. Basically, they work on the principle of trying to go for an unbroken run. And there is something in us, whether it's a competitive thing or whatever it may be, that makes us want to do that. And Epictetus was aware of that. That's why he wrote what he wrote. Today it was 1 day, now it's 2 days, now it's 3 days. If you say, I haven't done this for 10 days, it's going to be harder to break that, because it's like breaking a game or a score that you've created. So the habits do that. They create patterns that, after a long time of avoiding the bad habit, if you break it now, it's going back to square zero, your lines disappear, your pictures or your score, whatever. And it really helps you do exactly what Epictetus is telling us to do. And that is, as you keep it up longer and longer, your lines get longer and longer, it's harder and harder to break them. And the app helps you break the habit, because you don't want to break the score, the graph on the app. Epictetus says that for your journal. If you're going to stick to the journal, that's the principle. As that number goes up of I haven't been angry for this many days, or I haven't reacted that way for this many days, it becomes harder and harder to do this. And Epictetus goes on to tell us that this technique can be used to overcome all other problematical thoughts. There are lots of wrong thoughts that we have, whether they're negative thoughts about ourselves, whether they're inappropriate or outdated responses to things, whether it's coming from a moral point of view, and they're impure thoughts of some kind. Of course, that's the example that he gives of how to control lusting after people that you're not supposed to lust after. But the point is that wherever you're coming from, how to master your mind and how to master your reactions at any level, not just anger, is to follow this pattern of breaking old habits and creating new habits. He says, make your wish to be pure in accordance with your beliefs, and then follow Plato's advice of keeping company of those people who are similar and who support that kind of belief, and not keeping company of those who lead you into your bad habits. And if your bad habits are addictions or behaviors that have caused a great deal of negative consequences in your life, it sounds old-fashioned and it sounds like your parents, but that's what I keep on saying. The ancestors have been trying to tell us the same thing since the most ancient of times, and that's even important in cultures like our African cultures, which venerate the ancestors. That the point is, it's the value system and the accumulated experience of the ancestors that we're trying to capitalize on. We're not wanting to worship them or live in the past. We're trying to understand how we can benefit from the accumulated experience of those who came before us. Plato, incidentally, goes on to say you can also keep company of the dead. Whether you're admiring the great philosophers like Socrates or anyone else in history that you admire, reading about them, learning more about them, seeing how they lived and thinking about that, those things influence us. Epictetus' words are, if you muster these thoughts against the impression, it will go your way. Don't allow yourself to be dazzled by the rapidity of the impact something has on us. And he acknowledges that our reactions are so fast that we can get overpowered, bowled over by that. But he says rather say, hold on a second, impression. Let me see what you are, my impression. Let me test you out. What are you an impression of? And then think it through. Think about what follows in this situation. Epictetus warns you, don't let it take possession of you, but in thinking it through, see how can I replace my usual response with a noble response. Even if it feels like you're faking it, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all. But the important thing is that catch it before it runs with you. Think it through. And then say, I will replace it. Because we respond to things so quickly and the reaction is so instinctive. It's easier said than done because often that reaction carries us away. But we're building this on building the new habits and on applying the rational. And like that, gradually changing the behavior. Replacing with a noble thought might be replacing it with who I would like to be, with how would Plato have responded to this, or someone in history that I admire. But the important thing is that you try and insert the rational mind into the process. Because rationally, you know that if I let this carry on, the tweet storm follows, all hell breaks loose, and even if I was wronged, it isn't worth all of that. So let me see what I am in control of. Let me see really who's in control, and let me apply my rational mind. Epictetus has lovely words for that. He says, if you get into the habit of carrying out the exercises he's given you, you'll see what shoulders you develop, and what muscles, and what great strength. But it's not easy. Think of the work it takes to build muscles. Nevertheless, of course, it's also worth thinking about how far you go in 30 days. Epictetus reminds us of this, and he says it's true about everything else as well. Do the work. Don't expect it to be easy, but acknowledge yourself. If you're using his diary system of keeping a track on yourself and trying to build towards 30 days, the day that you're able to write, I haven't done X for 30 days, in many ways you are a changed person. But don't be complacent. Remember that you can fall out of practice. As Epictetus says, if you're defeated on one occasion and say that you'll win at some other occasion, and then allow yourself to be defeated again, you can be sure that eventually you'll be in such a bad state that you won't understand what you're doing wrong, and you won't realize that you're doing wrong. You might blame your misfortune on bad luck and on the world around you and on other people. You will begin to put forward arguments that justify your behavior, and at that point you've invited calamity. Very powerful thoughts and a very powerful warning from Epictetus. If you remember his initial premise, and that is that it's all about habit. You can change an old habit and you can create a new habit. You can stay on top of that using your rational mind, using a journal, and maybe a habit breaking and making app. But all of that is not just about not smoking, tidying your room, or everyday habits like that, but fundamentally changing your psychology. So that's a very powerful gift from the school of Stoicism as a practical school of philosophy that says you can change yourself, and in 30 days you can notice a significant change. So, time to break a few habits, and our emotional reactions being the most important ones to understand. Finally, a tip from the Stoics on how to make sure that you have a good day, how to guarantee that you have a good day. Epictetus tells us, if you want something good, get it from yourself. You can't rely on the world or anything else to provide a good day. Nothing else is under your control. Do something you know makes you feel good and makes you feel right and makes it feel like a good day. If you control the thing that makes this a good day, then the other stuff is irrelevant, because you've learned the Stoic act of saying, that which I can't control, I can't allow to affect me. Remember the basic idea. If you want some good in your life today, go and get it from yourself, and you'll have a great day. Nothing like a bit of ancient wisdom to remind you that the more things change, the more they stay the same. We will be back with some more great Stoic wisdom in future episodes next week, and 2 weeks after that we've got a rebroadcast of the amazing interview with Sangoma and Tomitonga. In the middle of that, it'll be the month ahead, so we'll pop in for a look at that. Don't miss it. Exciting stuff coming up. See you next week.